Welcome to the examination of one of the greatest games played in the Sicilian Defense. In this game, Mark Taimanov implements all the main strategic ideas of this opening. As a result, White becomes completely paralyzed and cannot move any of his pieces. A careful study of this game will enhance your understanding and execution of the Sicilian Defense. So let's dive into this positional masterpiece. Taimanov's opponent, Wolfgang Unzicker, starts with e4 and Taimanov plays his favorite Sicilian defense. After knight f3, knight c6, d4, c takes d, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3 and d6, White has different options, such as bishop g5, bishop c4, or as was the case in our game, bishop e2. Taimanov opts for the Boleslavsky variation. Instead of playing e6, he pushes the pawn to e5. Which on the one hand has a terrible drawback because now black has a weak backward pawn in his position, which will be a target of attack. White major pieces will put a lot of pressure on this pawn on the half-open d-file. Besides that, by playing e5, black has permanently weakened the d5 square, and white might get a chance to create a great outpost on this square. On the other hand, by playing e5, black took under control the important squares on white's territory and gets a chance to initiate an active, dynamic piece play. So now the white knight is under attack, so white must do something. If he exchanges on c6, after b takes c, black would regain the control over the d5 square and open the b-file for his major pieces. Another option for white is to retreat the knight to b3, with the idea of initiating the active play on the king side by means of f4. Or the third option, as was the case in our game, is knight f3. So now the main fight is for the control of the crucial d5 square. White will try to take this square under control and eventually create a great outpost on this square for his pieces, while black will try to take this square under control and eventually execute a liberating breakthrough, the d5 breakthrough, getting rid of the backward d6 pawn. So the control over this d5 square is very important, and that helps us understand black's next move. White would love to exchange his dark squared bishop for the knight, because his dark squared bishop cannot take part in the fight for the light d5 square, while the f6 knight is one of the key defenders of this square. So white would love to play bishop g5 next move and exchange his bishop for the knight. For this reason, Taimanov makes a prophylactic move. Before developing his kingside, he plays h6, preventing bishop g5. And only after Unzicker castles, Taimanov plays bishop e7. So now black is ready to develop his bishop, taking the d5 square under control one more time and push the pawn forward. That's why Unzicker makes a prophylactic move, rook e1, indirectly preventing the possible d5, after black of course plays bishop e6, because on e1 the rook is indirectly attacking the black e5 pawn. So as soon as black plays d5, white would exchange on d5, opening the e-file for his rook, and the e5 pawn will be attacked twice, by the knight and by the rook, while it would be defended only by the c6 knight. So Taimanov castles, and now if so white of course needs to move the bishop away from the rook's away so that the rook can indirectly attack this pawn, but if white does it right away, bishop g4 might be quite unpleasant, which would pin the knight. That's why before moving the bishop away to f1, Unzicker makes a prophylactic move h3, preventing possible bishop g4. So now of course black could have still played bishop e6, but after bishop f1 it would turn out that d5 doesn't work, because after the mass exchanges on this square, eventually white would win a pawn. For this reason, instead of developing the bishop to e6, Taimanov will develop it on b7. From b7 the bishop will put pressure on the e4 pawn together with the f6 knight. So Taimanov starts the implementation of one of the main strategic ideas of the Sicilian defense, namely the active play on the queen side. He plays a6, taking the b5 square under control, preparing b5, which will vacate the b7 square for the bishop, and also threaten b4, kicking out the knight from c3. And after the bishop is developed on b7, the c8 square will be vacated for the rook, and the pressure down the c-file, of course, is another main strategic idea of the Sicilian defense. So, Unzicker plays bishop f1 and, of course, b5. Now it would be better for white to play actively, namely a4, attacking b5 pawn. And after possible b4 and knight d5, the game would be very complicated. But instead of active a4, Unzicker plays a3, preventing the possible advance of the black pawn. And of course, bishop b7 followed, increasing the pressure on the e4 pawn. And it turns out that white actually has difficulties in finishing his development. He needs to develop his bishop. But where? The g5 and f4 squares are inaccessible for the bishop, and if white develops the bishop on the most natural e3 square, the bishop would close the rook's file and the rook wouldn't defend the e4 pawn anymore. And by playing knight a5, black would open the bishop's diagonal and threaten to capture this pawn, and white most probably would be forced to move the bishop away from e3 in order to hold the pawn, and after that the black knight might invade c4, again attacking the bishop and the pawn, and most probably white would be forced to give up his bishop pair, and black would get the advantage of two bishops. So instead of natural bishop e3, Unzicker plays b3, vacating the b2 square for the bishop, so he's going to develop his bishop on b2. Taimanov occupies the half-open c-file, rook c8, and after bishop b2, we have reached the critical position. Of course, black has put pressure in the center on white's central pawn and on white's queen side. But this pressure isn't sufficient, so black must increase the pressure on the main targets on e4 and c2. But how to do it? In order to do it, black needs to reorganize his army. And now you can pause the video and try to find Taimanov's idea and the first move that begins the execution of this idea. What to do with the queen? Where should the f8 rook go, which at the moment isn't doing anything? And what to do with the c8 rook? So the first move that begins the execution of this idea is rook c7. Opening the queen's way to a8, so the queen belongs on a8. From a8 it will increase the pressure on e4. Black will create the bishop and queen battery on this diagonal, and after the black queen moves to a8, the rook ways to c8 would be open, and the black rooks would double on the c-file, and the pressure on both e4 and c2 will reach its maximum. And that will be very unpleasant. After black does it, the e4 pawn might fall, so white must take immediate measures against this. He must think about the safety of his e4 pawn. And the best way of parrying this threat was knight d5, but Unzicker didn't play it. And it's understandable, because after knight d5, black would have exchanged on d5, and white wouldn't be able to capture with the queen, which would be a terrible blunder because of knight d4, with the discovered attack on the white queen, and the queen would get trapped. So after knight takes d5, white would be forced to capture with a pawn, which is a positional concession, because the white pawn would close the d-file for the white major pieces, and white major pieces won't be able to put pressure on black's backward d6 pawn anymore, and the black pawn would be much safer after this. In this case, after possible knight b8, besides having a safer pawn on d6, black also will initiate an active play on the king side. As the white pawn has disappeared from e4, black might think about f5. However, white will have his counter chances on the queen side, because white would get the pawn majority on the queen side, 4 pawns against black 3 pawns, and by playing c4, white might begin his advance on the queen side. And after possible b takes c, of course white might think about preparation of c5, but black can prevent it by playing knight d7. The knight will be greatly placed on c5, black will also play f5, but white in his turn will play bishop c2, for example, bishop c3, for example, followed by rook b1, putting pressure on the open b file, followed by possible a4, a5, increasing the pressure on black's queen side. So the game would be very complicated in this case. But at least black would have some counter chances on the queen side. But it's understandable that white didn't want to play knight d5, because the d file, as was already mentioned, would close in this case, and the d6 pawn would be much safer. So instead of knight d5, Unzicker plays knight b1. The idea is to unblock the c-pawn, so white is going to play c4 next move in order to take the d5 square under full control and preventing the possible d5 advance once and for all. Besides that, from b1 the knight is heading to d2 in order to reinforce the weak e4 pawn. Of course, queen a8 followed, increasing the pressure. Now black is threatening to move the knight away from c6, after which the e4 pawn will be attacked 3 times, and at the moment it's defended only once. So white doesn't have time for c4, he needs to defend his pawn first. That's why Unzicker plays knight d2, defending the pawn, and knight d8, moving away from the bishop's way. Again, white doesn't have time for c4, he needs to defend the pawn. That's why bishop d3, and now knight e6. Knight might jump on each of these squares, so the knight is greatly placed on e6, and it turns out that one more time c4 doesn't work, because on c2 the pawn was defending the bishop, and now that the pawn has left c2, the knight from e6 might jump on c5, attacking both the unguarded bishop and the e4 pawn for the 4th time. So white doesn't have time to retreat his bishop, because the e4 pawn would fall. So white would have to defend his bishop, after which he would lose his light squared bishop, and black would get the advantage of 2 bishops, and the light squares would be even more weakened, because white wouldn't have the light squared bishop anymore to defend these pawns. For this reason, Unzicker realized that he doesn't have any chances for the active play anymore, as c4 doesn't work. So the only thing he can do now is trying to reinforce and hold this position. So he plays passively, and he makes a defensive move, rook c1, defending the c2 pawn. Rook c8, increasing the pressure on the c file. So the e4 pawn is weak, and all white pieces are tied to its defense. That's why Unzicker plays knight h2, unblocking the f pawn, and if needed he will push this pawn to f3 in order to reinforce the e4 pawn. Knight d7. The knight is rerouted to the queen side in order to increase the pressure on this part of the board. And from c5, of course, the knight will also target the bishop. Besides that, now that the black knight has left the f6 square, the bishop's diagonal is open. At the moment, this bishop is black's worst piece, because it's restricted by its own pawn on d6, but on g5, the bishop will be greatly placed, and it will increase the pressure on white's queen side, and of course it will pin the knight. Knight f1. White wants to reroute this knight to the queen side, to the defense of the queen side. Knight c5, targeting the bishop. Knight g3. White hopes to invade f5, but Taimanov prevents it. g6, completely restricting the knight, so on g3 the knight doesn't have any prospects. That's why white plays knight e2, rerouting the knight to the queen side, also temporarily preventing the possible invasion of the black knight on f4, and also as the knight has left g3, and on g3 it was defending the pawn, and as the knight is standing in front of the rook, closing its file. So that means the e4 pawn isn't sufficiently defended. So by playing knight e2, white sets a positional trap. He wants to induce his opponent to capture the pawn. But it turns out that if black captured the pawn, after the mass exchanges on this square, for the pawn, white would get some compensation. He would have played knight c3 with the discovered attack on the black queen, and after the black queen retreats, the white knight would invade the great d5 square with a tempo, and white would get some activity, some counterplay for the pawn as a compensation. But Taimanov doesn't want to give his opponent any counter chances. So he refrains from capturing this pawn. Instead, he increases the pressure on his opponent's queenside, bishop g5, as he intended to, pinning the knight and indirectly attacking the rook, and creating an immediate threat of bishop takes d2, of course, because the knight is defending the pawn. So after bishop takes d2 and queen takes d2, this time black can capture on e4, and white wouldn't get any compensation for the pawn, because eventually black will have a piece on this square, not the queen. So white wouldn't have any chances for the discovered attack on the black queen on e4. So, for this reason, to defend the e4 pawn, white plays knight c3. But on e2, the knight was controlling the d4 square, and on c3, the knight is closing the bishop's diagonal. So, neither of these white pieces control the d4 square anymore, and the black knight invades this great central square, and again creating an immediate threat. On d4, the knight is targeting the b3 pawn. So black is threatening to exchange on d3, and after c takes d, the white pawn will disappear from c2. It will not defend the pawn anymore. So the only defenders of the b3 pawn would be the knight and the queen. And black would simply capture on d2, and after queen takes d2, the d4 knight would capture on b3, forking the queen and the rook. To prevent this, white plays knight b1. Now, of course, it doesn't make any sense to capture on d2, because the b1 knight will replace the white knight on d2 square, and b3 will remain under control. But now it's time for the implementation of another key strategic idea of the Sicilian defense, the breakthrough in the center. The e4 pawn is restricting the queen and bishop battery, so the breakthrough d5, after which the e4 pawn is eliminated and the power of the battery increases. White cannot eliminate this great knight. Bishop takes d4 would be a blunder because of knight takes d3 with a fork. So white must capture the knight, after which the c file opens and black captures on c1 and wins. For this reason, after d5, as bishop takes d4 doesn't work, white captures on d5. Knight takes d3 followed, c takes d. White is ready to capture this great knight, but Taimanov prevents it. He captures on c1, and white must capture with the bishop. The knight will survive on this great square. And only now Taimanov captures on d5, threatening to capture on g2. So white must play f3. Now white is ready for bishop b2 in order to exchange this great knight, but Taimanov prevents it. Rook c2, invading the second rank and preventing bishop b2. So white's entire army is completely paralyzed. The knight cannot move. The only square it can move is c3, but it's controlled by the black rook. The bishop, as was already mentioned, cannot move to b2. The second knight cannot leave the d2 square, because as soon as it does, rook takes c1 would follow. The queen has the only square, but this square is controlled by the knight. And finally, the last piece, if it captures on e5, then queen c6 would follow, threatening to capture on c1. the only move would be rook e1, but in this case, the tactics. Rook takes c1, luring the white queen to c1, and knight e2 check with the fork, winning the queen. If white captures, of course, the rook would stop defending the queen, and the queen would be lost anyways. So, white is paralyzed. He doesn't have any space to move. He is completely squeezed and cramped. White tries a4, at least creating one square for his pieces. He is going to play either bishop a3 or knight a3, but Taimanov is merciless. He prevents it by playing b4, squeezing white even more. Now white cannot move at all. The only thing he can do is to move his king back and forth, or to move his rook from e1 to f1 and back to e1. That's the only thing he can do. He can just wait, while black is going to start a devastating attack on the white king, because all white's paralyzed army is on the queen side, and they cannot take part in the defense of the king. So black is going to play bishop f4, followed by knight f5 and knight g3. For example, after king h1, which actually took place in our game, and queen c6, black increases the pressure. Now the pressure reaches its maximum, and white, for example, can move his rook back and forth, and after bishop f4, black would take under control this diagonal. Rook e1, knight f5. Now there is no rook f1 anymore because of the fork. Neither can the rook move to g1, because after knight g3 check, the king would fall under the discovered check. So the only move would be king g1. Now only king can move, but after queen b6 check, the white king would get checkmated. After king f1, checkmate in 1 would follow, and after king h1, still knight g3 check, king h2, knight e4 discovered check, king h1, knight f2 check, king g1, knight takes h3 discovered double check. Now if king f1, queen f2 checkmate, and if king h1, the standard smothered checkmate would follow. Queen g1 check, rook takes g1, and knight f2 checkmate. For this reason, in this position, after queen c6, Unzicker resigned. And now I recommend watching a game where Taimanov employs the Sicilian defense against no one other than Anatoly Karpov and defeats him in a magical way. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.